thank you all so much for joining us. We will be kicking off by firstly introducing our two guest disruptors. We have two with us this morning, and they are Helen Mitchell, who is the Innovation Director at Standard Industries. Helen has spent 17 years in senior roles in the city, including Global Head of Digital Marketing at Barclays, as well as co-founding a broker and matchmaking business, Blue Kudu, as well as representing the UK government to venture capitalists globally. We also have Eitan Buchalter with us this morning. He is the Director of Innovation at the Global Governance Institute. He has worked with clients as varied as NASA, Big Pharma, HM Treasury, P&G, Tate Modern, and many more. And his primary interest is the culture of innovation and helping individuals and organizations to nurture and enhance their creative abilities. So thank you both so much for joining. It's great to have you with us.
Thank you. Good morning.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure to be here.
And this morning, as I mentioned, this is our very first episode in our new series, which is focused on innovation. And for this episode, we are looking at the anatomy of innovation. So we want to really drill into the innovation basics and actually looking at big picture innovation and how it can be best cultivated within organizations. So to kick off, I would like to ask both of you just a very straightforward question. What is innovation and what is it for? Eitan, if we come to you first.
Sure, no problem. Well, I think that for me, the simplest definition of innovation is thinking about something that is both new and useful. And that it's important that we think about that as an individual. New and useful to me, new and useful to an organization, and new and useful to society, or sort of three different layers that you can think about that. Importantly, it completely depends on context. So what is the problem you're trying to solve, and how do you do that? I think it's also useful to think about the difference between innovation as a process, if we're talking about that, or if we're talking about an innovation as an outcome. Might sound a bit like a semantic argument, but I think it's a really important distinction when we're talking about innovation, so that we're clear about whether we're talking about an outcome or the process. So that's I won't waffle on too much about that, but yeah.
That's a great point, Eitan. We at Standard, we also distinguish between the what and the how, if you like. I think we look at innovation as a combination of the application of new technologies and the different ways of working that can be applied while using those and experimenting with those new technologies. But it's also, how do we harness the collective intelligence of our organization and of the ecosystem in which we operate. And so that's the mindset, the culture element that you're so passionate about. So the mindset and the behaviors that come with looking at innovation and doing innovation and creating innovation outcomes. And it's also about the tools that you use and really how we make decisions within Standard as an organization.
Absolutely.
We make decisions differently around innovation.
I think that's really right. And when you're talking about innovation as a process or way of thinking or way of being, and the factors that facilitate that, versus how we typically measure or reward innovation, which is as an outcome, then you see that they start to become this sort of disparity, start to tease this thing apart, where we are supporting the outcomes rather than the process, and that can have a lot of far-reaching consequences, I think, as you start to think about what you can do to create a better environment where people can develop ideas.
I think it's really interesting that both of you have picked up on this idea of outcome versus process, and actually what does that outcome look like. I think it would be good to chat about that a bit more, and I guess, yeah, let's try and articulate what actually should be the outcome of innovation.
Well, I think, if I think about that in the context of the company I work in, I think it differs depending on where you sit within the organization. And I think, you know, we have over 150 manufacturing plants globally, and, you know, innovation outcomes and process in those plants tend to be, certainly at the moment, they tend to be focused around Horizon 1. So looking at sort of productivity gains, and we put cameras and sensors on the production line, and then we combine that with machine learning models to detect defects early in the production process. And that's about how do we optimize our production, how do we reduce the amount of waste that we have. But if you look at, say, we have 6 R&D centers in Europe and we have 9 R&D teams in North America, and their focus is very much around materials and the physical product. So, and that is a much longer and further looking horizon for them, and around the chemical engineering side. So quite different there. And then if you look at HQ, we looking at innovation. We're very focused on how do we promote and engender collaboration, which collaborative tools can we use, and helping show the art of the possible. So we tend to focus more on the Horizon 2 and Horizon 3. So it's very different. And do you find that, Eitan?
So, yeah, I mean, I think in talking about, I think that the question was what, sorry, repeat the question again, Shama. What was it? That was, why is innovation useful?
Yeah, just thinking about those outcomes that both of you have mentioned.
Yeah.
And I mean, Helen's talked about some being productivity optimization. And what would you add to that list?
Yeah, I mean, I think that in terms of the utility of innovation as a process, we can think about it along this sort of continuum. So on one end, I think you can have incremental innovation, tweaks and things that kind of make things sort of a little bit better. And with those sorts of innovations, you can start to, you can draw a straight line between your objective and the outcome. We want to achieve X. It's going to take us 6 months. We're going to deliver X. You deliver X, and you get rewarded for that. And that's on the incremental side of innovation. If you're interested in going to the other end of the scale, or somewhere closer to the other end of the scale, on the more kind of radical side of innovation, that's the point at which you can't anymore draw a straight line between what you start off thinking you're going to do and where you're going to end up. And at that point, you have got to be much more comfortable with uncertainty. You've got to be very well prepared to fail, and you've got to be able to adapt as you go, and be very open-minded and optimistic as you kind of continue along that journey. Otherwise you won't, because you don't know what you're going to achieve, and you don't know because it's better than you can imagine at that moment. So I think it's important for organizations to decide where along this scale they want to be, or what proportion of their innovation portfolio they want at different points of it. Maybe you want to have 70% is incremental and 30% is radical, you know, or maybe you just want 5% radical and 95 incremental. And that, by the way, is one of the most common proportions, because most companies aren't that. It's very, very, very hard to deal with a large proportion of your innovation capability doing things that you have no idea what the outcome is going to be, what the return on investment is going to be. You just got to basically trust individual intelligence and say, go and make something great. And it's very hard to do that at scale. Some organizations manage it, but so yeah, that's how I would think about it.
I think I would love to come back to the ideas you've brought up there, the ideas around experimenting and uncertainty. So we'll come back to those ideas for sure. I'm noticing there are lots more people joining us. If you are joining us a bit later, welcome to you. Thank you so much for joining. If you have any questions that you would like to pose to Helen and Eitan later on in the session, we will come to those questions. If you would like to add them into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, please do just add those questions in as we're talking, and we'll come on to those later. So yeah, thank you for that answer, Eitan. I think that idea of the incremental all the way to the radical, that's a very helpful way of thinking about it. And I guess that brings me on to my next question, which is, how does innovation strategy best support business strategy, especially when we've got all these different types of innovation which have different outcomes? How can the innovation teams best be matching up with the rest of the business? Helen, I'll come to you for that first.
Thank you. So, the two are synonymous, really, for me and for the work that we do at Standard. I think we're entirely business-led, and our innovation strategy is inextricably hooked into our long-term business strategy. I think, in September last year, one of our largest operating companies brought in a new CEO, and on a change agenda. And so the focus has been to really bring in big change and to turn the oil tanker, if you like. And I think what we've quite deliberately and intentionally put in place to align with that business strategy is the capability to focus on not just what's needed to bring in those big changes to turn the oil tanker, but to really get ready for and create capacity and capability within the organization, so that when the business is ready or more ready to adopt some of the new technologies, some of the new ways of working, that they are there and they are tested, and a lot of that sort of groundwork has been done. So for us, we've got a very clear and multi-year business strategy, and then aligned to that we have a very clear innovation strategy. Now at the moment our innovation functions are a hybrid between a ring-fence set of activities and those that are built into our R&D capabilities. So a little bit what's interesting about what Eitan said around incremental to radical, we also have that mix. And our radical stuff tends to be a little bit more ring fence, where it's a safe space to experiment and to fail, and to make that where we have a greater appetite for risk in those areas, because we're allowed to. And I think there are that's not always possible when you're trying to keep the lights on, is it?
Absolutely not. Yeah, I think that yeah, I think that it's having the innovation strategy and business strategy intertwined is absolutely essential, and it needs some very, very careful thought. It could be a perfectly legitimate business strategy to not have any radical innovation at all, and to just play it safe and go with incremental innovation. And so often there's a lot of stigma involved in that. It's like, you're not innovating properly, you're not really doing that, Well, actually, you're doing what your business needs to survive, and that's the point of being in business. Is you need to fulfill those business objectives. Now, you might want to decide that those business objectives should be focusing on something else, and at that point, readjust, adapt your innovation strategy to suit that. But I think it's important to be very, very clear about what you're trying to achieve before you decide on what your innovation strategy is, because otherwise you'll end up shooting yourself in the foot, really. And it can be very debilitating for an organization to have a lot of people doing radical innovation, when really what it needs is a lot of people doing incremental innovation.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah,
getting that balance right is so critical, isn't it?
I think this also helps us think about the long term versus the short term. And obviously for businesses at the moment, Helen, you've mentioned that you've got a multi-year business strategy, and actually with crises like this, that can completely, for some businesses it doesn't have such an impact, but for many it really does have an impact on the multi-year plan. And I guess the question is, how does innovation then step in to help in these situations? How can innovation rebuild the business so it's either back on track with its multi-year plan, or it helps reform a new plan? What are your thoughts on the way that innovation can best be doing that?
So I think, given the situation that we all find ourselves in, I think, there is there's one truth here, which is we are not going to go back to exactly where we left off before the pandemic started. So, and that is a gift when we talk about innovation, actually, which is that we do need to reinvent our models, and we do need to rethink how we operate. And I can see in the Q&A chat there's some questions about resilience in our supply chains. But in any business, the pandemic has really brought in deep scrutiny what the resilience of companies are, and I think that's where innovation really can add huge value. And I think so. What we're seeing in Standard is a renewed appetite to rethink existing, what seem to be very stable, very secure business models and processes and products. And we're also looking at replanning some of the things that we planned over the medium term. We're now bringing forward, as you mentioned in your question. I think if I go back to my comment earlier about sort of the different time horizons, there is undoubtedly a greater focus at the moment on innovation in the immediate term. So the Horizon 1 activities around protecting our business, around contributing to EBITDA and our sales targets, and the sort of cash flow of our business. So I think that whilst we haven't radically changed our strategy, I think there is more focus on the near term. But because of the way that we have, innovation doesn't happen in just one area within the company, in one team. We have the ability to continue to look at longer term activities as well as the immediate term. And just one point also is that we have a concept of innovation as a service in our organization, whereby any function, department or individual can call on a set of tools and a set of services and expertise that is available to them to look at a business challenge that they face, and we have expedited that rollout so that becomes more available particularly at the moment.
Thank you for that, Helen. Eitan, I don't know if you've got any thoughts to add on that. That was a very comprehensive answer, I think.
No, it was excellent. I really agreed with a lot of what Helen was saying. I think that only thing to add is really that I think that when you're talking about individuals who had in the past specific projects that they had to deliver on, within timescales, and now these timescales are completely transformed, yet they are still being delivered, and they're still finding ways to do this. I think that it's a mark of how creativity can step in at these moments, and also a nice reminder after these times that things that we might not think to question, things that we might methods, for example, that we might fight to retain, they can all be transformed. We can do them differently, and it might not compromise the outcome. It might in fact give us new opportunities to see things completely differently. And I suppose it's about developing an appetite for doing that, an appetite for change in that sense, rather than a resistance to it. And I think maybe that's hopefully one of the legacies that we might see from these times.
Definitely. I think the fact that we're in such uncertain times, and that change needs to happen instantly. I mean, like you've both been saying, we've been seeing across businesses, and definitely with lots of the people I've been speaking to, there's a lot of conversation about how quickly projects that were going to happen, but there wasn't enough urgency for them to happen, have actually just had to happen in a matter of days rather than months. And that acceleration has really been part of, I guess, the business response to what we're seeing at the moment. Eitan, you've already kind of touched on the fact that you think this is more of a legacy. Helen, I don't know if you agree, if this acceleration of innovation is something that we're going to see stay, or actually we might just go back to the kind of jumping through the hoops that innovation teams had to do beforehand in order to get a project to completion.
I mean, I think that one of the things that this time has taught us, or allow us to kind of remember, is that we can do it. And so I think it's having that thought that, it can be done, it can be changed, and you can just have a go, and not to be too sort of disheartened too quickly. You just make it happen. And
Hello, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I honestly don't think, corporate inertia is always quite a strong factor in any situation, but I do not think that anyone really feels that we can go back and to something to entirely the same way that we operated before. And I think taking advantage of the crisis has meant that there is a greater appetite to look at the new and to do it quickly. And I work in an industry in construction that largely hasn't changed in 100 years. Roof building is not that different today than it was decades ago. And compare it to other industries like financial services, is relatively slow to digitize. And I think, but what we've seen is almost overnight, quite literally overnight, an organization has become more digitally savvy and more able to take advantage of digital technologies than ever before. And without the crisis, I think that transition would have taken us 10 years because of the culture change, because of the learning and the way that we optimally would choose to learn new things, but we've just been forced to. And I think that is one of the few really positive things that's come out of this, certainly for my organization.
Thank you for that. I think we are actually having a whole ton of questions flow in, so I think it would be good to move on to those and just have a look at answering some of those questions. We have had a lot about, I think, probably bouncing off what both of you have been talking about with experimentation and that more radical end of innovation. So I think let's start with, we have a question here from Steve Wright. So thank you, Steve, for this. He asks, do you think there should be a percentage failure target to encourage risk taking?
Well, I mean, yeah, okay. I like the idea of it. I like the idea of a failure target. I think that it's more, what's needed is more a definition or replacing of the word failure within this process of innovation. Now, if you are interested in that more radical end, failure is just an ingredient that you have to incorporate into this, and so you just it's how it goes. And so if I've been in many boardrooms and have people talking about failing fast the whole time, and that's fine, but at the end of the day, at the end of the year, in fact, when somebody comes into their annual review and says to their boss, oh yeah, I've had a great year, I spent all year failing super fast, all these failures, here's 10 failures I've are they still going to get promoted? Will they still get their bonus? You know, all of these things, will that be celebrated within the organization? And I think that we need to start just to think about it as just a necessary component, because unless you are prepared to fail, and unless the organization is prepared for you as an individual or as a team to fail, then you won't do anything in the radical end of it. And so the difficulty I have with targets, though, is that it then starts to incentivize something else. So I think it's just more a readiness and an appetite for incorporating failure into the environment of innovation as a necessary ingredient, but not as something that you would necessarily look to kind of incentivize singularly.
Helen, do you have any thoughts on that?
No, I share that view completely. It's a really interesting idea, but I would be worried about the behaviors that it would engender if you start setting targets. You're sort of biasing the way the outcomes and the way that the teams would behave. I think that you know, it is just intrinsically linked into any kind of innovation practice, and therefore perhaps it's not about calling it out. It's, you know, it's actually just something that you need to live with. Now, that, you know, it is not easy, there is no question about it, and particularly in more conservative organizations, like some of the ones that I've worked in the past, you know, that it is quite a battle to get people to feel comfortable with a level of risk around failure. But it is possible, and I think the more you do it, the more comfortable you get with it.
And I think just as a final quick point, I would also add that it helps enormously if those in senior positions can demonstrate their own failures and make failure an acceptable behavior to have. And that can be one way to start to sort of change the dial on how failure is interpreted throughout an organization.
And to do that, you need to talk about it. You know, it needs to be okay to say, we tried this, I did this, we did that, and it didn't work, and this is what we learned from it. And I think if you start being able to talk like that and know that you're not going to get shot down for it, then it becomes part of a common activity and a common way of a tolerance that sort of becomes baked into the organization.
Yeah, I think on this whole attitude to failure, one thing I'll just say quickly, one stat that has come out of our digital trends report for this year, which is a survey of our membership, gives quite a stark contrast. So for the statement, my organization forbids public failure, 32% of startups strongly disagreed versus 2% of large organizations. So I think that really does give that behavioral piece as well on how different organizations kind of like the psychology behind it, and actually what is perceived to be okay and what isn't. So I think that was a really interesting question. Thank you, Steve, for bringing that up. We have another question here, which is staying in the same thread, from Lawrence John. He asks, he says, working for a large enterprise, people err on the side of caution. Even when a small company develops compelling, groundbreaking technology, it can almost be impossible to get a meeting, much less a contract. Where do you both look for innovation when you need to achieve something that is not possible with current mainstream offerings?
Well, wonderful question, and one very close to my heart. So part of the journey that many companies go through is that learning that you don't have to build it yourself, that there's a power and a value, an exponential and an asymmetric gain from working with companies outside the organization. So one of my responsibilities at Standard is to develop partnerships with influential players and parties within ecosystems outside of the company. So when we define those ecosystems as government agencies, as academia, we do a lot of work with universities and with tech hubs predominantly, and then there's intermediaries around those players. And so we, being a North American owned business, but with a very large footprint in Europe, Asia and Africa, we are spending a lot of time in the ecosystems, in the tech hubs, and in working out where we can learn, where we have opportunities to bring the outside into our organization, and where we can find creativity and new ways of thinking and working that we don't have in-house, and how do we expose our staff to that as a way of changing our culture.
Eitan, do you have any thoughts on that as well?
I do. I mean, I think that it also depends on how you phrase this idea of what you want to achieve, right? If you have something very, very specific, or very, very specific problem that you need to solve, and you feel like you can't do that with current technology, well, I think that the solution there is to find bright people, trust them, and put some budget towards it, and then just let them get on with it. And also be prepared that maybe they won't come up with that solution, but maybe they'll come up with something else that's good. Mm-hmm. So you need to, by that same token, you can't necessarily bank on getting the solution that you think you need right now, because it might be that problem is completely redefined in a few months' time, and something else is presented as a more important solution, or a different direction for you to go in, and likewise your business strategy might change, and so on. And so I think that the thing to do is to work on a basis of trust, with people who you spend the time finding great people and trust them, is the short answer.
It does involve, doesn't it, a willingness to adapt, because when you work, if you're a large corporate with 15,000 people and you're working with a company with 10 staff, you need to adapt. And I think there's quite a lot of work that's needed internally to make sure that you can work without sort of crushing the organization that you want to partner with. And we started that process by looking at our procurement processes, and I think that's such a valuable place to re-examine what's happening internally, and how you think and operate internally as a big organization, and what that does when you want to work with a very nimble and agile company.
So I'll move us on to another question, but actually I think this is kind of the next stage for that, which is a question here from Buchalter Cardival, and he is asking, is there a set of metrics you recommend to collect and retrospect on the initiatives that you've put in place? So when you have thought about that more radical end of innovation, or looking for the kind of less mainstream innovation that we've just talked about, what are those metrics that you would recommend putting in place? So
I would steer away from metrics, because I think that what metrics are there often are in lieu of trust. So I've spoken a little bit about trust, but I think it's so important, because when people feel like they're trusted, they have that element of freedom to explore different ideas, to fail, to do all these important things that we know are required for that kind of radical end of innovation. And so if you start to measure different aspects, you're then starting to incentivize different parts of that. And so while I think metrics can be something that can certainly be useful when you're looking at it on a kind of macro scale within an organization, I think that if you're looking to support the radical end of innovation, then trust is more powerful than metrics, personally. Yeah.
We do look at, you know, innovation practice is quite a new, the way that we are doing it is relatively new to the organization. So we do, you know, and then I'm sure there are many people on this call that may be a bit further ahead than we are. But we look at we do look at things like how many opportunities our staff have had to come into contact with the activity that we're working on, that we call an innovation activity. So what is the learning opportunity and the exposure to not just the number of people, but also the spread across the organization, which areas of the organization have been involved. We also look at how the idea or the way of working or the some of the themes or ideas that are coming out of the work that we do are being taken back into a department or a function, and we measure whether that idea has been talked about, and you know, that's for us is a starting point to in our changing the culture internally. So is it a hard KPI? Well, we do measure it. It's not easy to measure, but we do stay away from some of the more common measures, like how much, what's the return on an investment for some of the stuff, because we don't know that yet.
Mm-hmm. Thank you both for that. I think we are running out of time, sadly, so I'll ask a couple more questions. There are so many interesting points here that I think are worth drilling into. So these are maybe things that we can talk about later on in the series, but we have a question here about the innovation team. So this asks, do you have any tips for overcoming people's unconscious bias for being over optimistic for their own ideas and therefore less receptive to ideas from elsewhere? This seems to hinder our version of the innovation as a service that Helen describes. So Helen, I think this is a question more directed towards you, but it would be good to get both of your thoughts.
Well, thank you. That's a good question. Well, first of all, recognizing that that's not easy. I think we have the concept of an innovation council, which we set up, which is like a group of very different expertise and experiences that through which our pipeline of ideas, it gets assessed. And we have a different criteria against which we assess those ideas. But the idea is that it's not a single person or a single group's decision, but it's still not consensus based. I mean, it is a select group, and it is dependent on what idea we're looking at. So if it's about something to do with our plants and factory of the future, then we will make sure that we have experts, subject matter experts from our industrial teams in that meeting. Whereas if it's something to do with crowdsourcing ideas, so harnessing creativity across our different teams and setting sort of gamifying that, then we might go to a different group of people and we'll use a different tool set, a different software and platform to enable that and facilitate that. So I think it's, you know, the short answer is you need to be open to different perspectives and get some contrarian views looking at that problem, so that you don't end up being channeled down a sort of unconsciously biased route.
Mm-hmm. We have another question which I think touches on what you've just spoken about, Helen, and Eitan, if I'll direct this one at you. This is from Samir Sharma, and he is asking, how do you improve creativity and innovation skills within teams and the ecosystem that they exist in? So a broad question, but I think you'll probably have thoughts on that.
Nice and easy. Well, I mean, it's super difficult, and it kind of very much depends on what it is that you want to achieve. So I would always go back to your business strategy and use that as your starting point. As a kind of a basis. So I would say that what the best thing to do is to provide an environment that actively facilitates creative thinking. And that environment, if you go into the wealth of academic research into this, has 6 different components to it. It requires motivation, openness, sensible risks, confidence, resilience, and expertise. And each of those has an enormous amount of complexity to it, but together they provide an environment which will sustain and nurture creative thinking within a team, an organization, society, and so forth. That's
Great, thank you.
I could be, I'm afraid.
No, it's a broad question, isn't it? I think that was good to touch on it. We're really sadly out of time, and there are so many more questions. So thank you everyone so much for putting in a question. If your question hasn't been answered, please do feel free to get in touch with me on my email, which is shama.banerjee@nimbus90.com, or even just editorial@nimbus90.com. And we will see how we can be building those ideas into the upcoming episodes, where we'll be drilling into more detail about different aspects of innovation. Helen and Eitan, thank you so much for joining. I think it's been a really valuable discussion. It's clearly that I think lots of what you've been saying has really resonated with people. So thank you so much for sharing your nuggets of wisdom and those really valuable thoughts. So thank you for that.